Welcome to my 2025 FIEA portfolio assignment. I chose to do the 2-week game prototype assignment for technical designers, and for my prototype, I chose to make a resistance and debuff system. The level I created is intended to be a museum-like walkthrough that will allow me to go over how each debuff works and how your resistance level influences the debuff effects. First, I'd like to give a brief overview of the UI you can expect to see throughout the level. In the top left, you'll notice that there's a health bar, and just below that is a resistance panel. That panel will update with your current resistances every time that you're affected by a debuff and when you pick up a resistance power-up. There are also a couple UI elements not currently visible. Just under the resistance panel, you can expect to see a debuff progress tracker that tells the player they are under the effects of a debuff and for approximately how long. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's start interacting with some of these debuffs. In each debuff zone, I've placed 3 actors. Well, 4, but one of them is just a teleporter. There's an exposure puddle, 3 resistance boosts, and a debuff spear. Interacting with the puddle will bring up the exposure bar. The longer you remain in the puddle, the closer you get to triggering the debuff. And when you step outside of the puddle, your exposure begins to go down. The length of time it takes you to become fully exposed corresponds with your resistance level. The higher resistance you have, the longer it will take you to become exposed and trigger a debuff. The trigger sphere skips that process entirely and instantly applies the debuff. This is more appropriate for certain debuffs and could be applied to projectiles and enemy attacks. Now let's see how higher resistances affect debuffs and exposure volumes. The maximum resistance you can achieve is 100, but 100 out of 100 of any resistance does not mean you are immune. Resistances are applied on a curve, and the maximum reduction to any debuff is an 80% reduction. For the slow debuff, resistances affect the duration and how much your character is slowed. Let's move on to the remaining debuffs now that we understand each of these actors. The cripple debuff impacts a player's movement abilities. At 0 resistance, it effectively removes your jump and dash. While at max resistance, you can get a little bit more air and distance with your movement abilities. The bleed debuff applies a damage over time effect. While at 0 resistance, it takes a painful 50% on your health. Higher resistances reduce the duration and damage applied per tick, making for a much more manageable debuff. The dark debuff applies a fog of war to the player, reducing their vision significantly. This is a debuff that would make a lot of sense to be applied through an exposure, as it's more of an environmental effect. Next, we have the paralyzed debuff. You can't have debuffs without a stun in the mix. The paralyzed debuff disables all movements and inputs from the player. Resistances reduce how long the player is paralyzed. The last and deadliest of the debuffs is poison. Poison inflicts a lethal amount of damage over time to the player. You will die by the time the debuff ends. But don't worry, there are antidotes to cure you if you're quick enough. Which brings us to resistances. Contrary to previous resistances, a higher poison resistance increases the duration of poison, giving you more time to reach an antidote. This is a debuff that would be best applied with exposure, as instantly being inflicted by a lethal debuff sounds brutal. That concludes our tour of the debuffs. Now, let's see who's been waiting for us in the center. Let me introduce you to the debuff manager. Well, not the actual debuff manager, as that's a formless blueprint, but a representation of the debuff manager, always watching and waiting to inflict pain. The debuff manager is a blueprint designed to respond to triggers and spawn debuffs on the player. It plays an essential role, and in conjunction with the game instance, which manages the data, these 2 blueprints make up almost the entirety of the resistance and debuff system, with just a little bit of help from the character controller. Which is why I figured I needed to give him some credit at the end. And this is the end. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation of this resistance and debuff system, and if you're interested in more detailed documentation of the project, you can check that out on my website or download it yourself through GitHub. Both these links can be found in the description. Thanks for watching.